Calill of the Tellius duology has long been one of my favorite Fire Emblem characters. Belonging to an archetype of characters that I already just really enjoy, it would have been difficult for me to not love her character. But like with a lot of other characters that I've looked at, there's more going on beneath the surface, and I think it's worth diving into the details of her character in video form. A confident mercenary magician, noted fashionista, and lover of city life, Calill lives free and true to herself, for better or worse. She has few stated goals beyond getting paid and maybe showing off a little, and at the start, she cares very little for anyone else around her save for possibly Largo. Calill first cameos in Chapter 14 of Path of Radiance. Having purchased more than she can carry on a shopping trip, she graciously gifts the player with a spirit dust that she bought. Side note, where is she buying this? There aren't any secret shops in Tellius, Calill. Hell, why is she not using it on herself? Her magic stat isn't even capped. Several chapters later, Calill appears again in a base conversation, still without her magic capped, this time offering her services to Ike's army as a wandering mercenary mage. Amusingly, she mistakes Ike for a common soldier rather than the commander, which becomes something of a running gag that's repeated again later with Largo. She offers quite the deal. She'll join the army for free and will accept payment after demonstrating her abilities and showing her worth, which, gotta say, is a pretty nice deal compared to a Hugh or a Farina. Calill's personality is pretty much crystal clear right out of the gate. She's confident, perhaps even to the point of arrogance, headstrong, and a little bit self-absorbed. And honestly, that's an archetype that I just love in Fire Emblem. She very much falls in line with the Sarahs, Larachelles, Constances, you know the type. They're all great, and I love all of them dearly. But there is a reason why I chose to look at Calill in particular for this video. Like most of the rest of the Tellius cast, Calill is lucky enough to show up in 2 different games, and across those appearances, she actually lands some pretty interesting character development that makes her stand out. The characterization that she's given across her games really elevates her from a fun, silly side character into being surprisingly developed and really endearing. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Given that there's a distinct and linear chronology to her 2 appearances, I'd like to quickly look at POR Calill first. And that, honestly, isn't a terribly difficult task. Calill is actually only given 3 supports total in her first appearance, but they thankfully do a solid job of establishing her character and giving a little bit of depth to work with right off of the bat. So let's just jump right in. In the first support that I want to take a look at, Calill approaches Nephany and praises her for her beauty. Though she isn't exactly asked, she decides to help Neph improve herself, assisting her to develop her confidence and become more sophisticated. With Tormod, Calill discusses the honestly pretty interesting magic lore of the Tellius series, while endeavoring to help the young mage learn and improve his magical abilities in the process, while also taking care to ensure that he keeps himself and others safe. Finally, she begins the Joffrey support by simply thirsting after the man, which, yeah, same. However, after realizing that he has feelings for Alencia, Calill shifts focus and becomes more relaxed and friendly to him while learning about the history of Alencia and Crimea, and then offering her sincere advice about both. A lot of these conversations initially come across as pretty comedic, but like with many characters in the series, these supports eventually show more sides of her and give the player a good sense of her character. I mean, okay, sure, a major component of her Joffrey support really is just her thirsting over him, as he doesn't really seem to catch her blatant advances, but that's not really all there is to it. When she correctly deduces that he has feelings for Alencia, she quickly drops the angle and becomes a supportive friend who offers him genuine advice. In fact, aside from one joke later, she entirely stops trying to hook up with him when she realizes that it's off the table. It's actually really sweet how Calill shifts focus so quickly and becomes such a good friend when she realizes that she has no chance with him romantically. She listens attentively to him when he discusses the political turmoil of Crimea, and she's quick to offer her own input when he finishes. This connection is actually lightly followed up on in Radiant Dawn, but we'll get to that a bit later. While she does boast about her own magic to the point of arrogance, Calill actually puts her money where her mouth is throughout the Tormod support. She proves to be an effective teacher for the kid, and takes on an honestly really sweet mentor relationship with him. She even shows that she's not as flippant as she seems by not only steering Tormod away from dangerous spirit channeling, but also teaching him how to improve himself without putting anyone else at risk. It'd be easy to show her as incompetent and just play off her overconfidence as a joke, maybe by having her fail to actually teach him anything, or by having Tormod easily surpass her, but Calill backs her claims up and is clearly an effective teacher. And, okay, look, I'm gonna be honest here, I've seen some people who really harshly criticize the Nephenee support. Admittedly, it does come across as a little bit condescending for the so-called sophisticated city woman to immediately jump in and try to fix the country girl, particularly in regards to her accent, and I've seen some people who really strongly hate the support line as a result of that. But with that said, she is ultimately trying to help Nef improve herself. Calill wants Nephenee to be her best self and truly shine. Yet again, she proves that she isn't quite as self-centered as she appears, even if Nephenee never really asked for her advice. It's actually also worth noting that it's revealed in the end of the support that Calill was initially from the country as well, before deciding that she wished to live as a city woman and changing herself, becoming the woman that she wanted to be. While this doesn't really come up again across either game or even her other supports, I do actually kind of appreciate this element of her backstory. I feel like this contributes to both her confidence and her bravado, as she seemingly molded herself into exactly who she wanted to be from scratch. As much as Calill may come across as a joke at times, she is who she wants to be. She's self-made and living her best life in the way that she wants to. While she's self-centered, there is actually a pretty clear through line of Calill being surprisingly insightful and sincere. Sure, you can argue that her form of help might be a bit condescending at times, but she does mean well across all three of her supports. She empathizes with Crymia's plight as she learns more about it, and sincerely wants to help Joffrey's quest for love. She teaches Tormod about magic while endeavoring to keep him and others safe, and she tries to help Nephenee's inner beauty shine and improve her confidence. She's nowhere near as self-centered as she initially appears, and is even outright sweet at times, forming tight bonds with all three characters that she's lucky enough to have a support with. And, well, that's largely it for Calill's first appearance. While I do enjoy seeing her sincere side come out more across her supports, that alone isn't really enough to justify this video existing. POR Calill is a fun character with some surprisingly sweet moments buried in her supports, but that's not really enough to justify a full video. But, let me introduce you to Radiant Dawn. Yes, like all Tellia's characters, aside from maybe Devdun, Calill gets a second chance to show up and flesh out her character. And honestly, she makes the most of it. It's her second appearance that really rounds out Calill and makes her so much more compelling to me. I mean, yeah, okay, the Tellia's cast getting more development in their second appearance isn't really something that's unique to just her. You can make similar arguments and even videos for a lot of that cast, given how much some of them change between their games. And then there's whatever the hell Astrid has going on in Radiant Dawn, but we just don't talk about that one. Calill first reappears in Radiant Dawn during Part 2, running an inn that was alluded to in Path of Radiance's ending. By this point, she's settled down with Largo, and the two have adopted a daughter named Amy. Calill works as something of a confidant for a number of the Crimean knights who gather in her inn. It's worth noting that Largo has injured himself by this point, having cut off his arm in a woodcutting accident. Allegedly, this is because the devs didn't want to add his class back into a new game, but I don't know how valid that is. When Crimea starts to face internal turmoil during Part 2, Calill immediately jumps in and says that she's willing to fight for Lincia's sake. While she's initially told to stand by, owing to the complicated political situation, a few chapters later she appears again after having been contacted by Lucia and formally becomes playable. As alluded to earlier, I really appreciate the little bit of continuity that Calill seemingly remains in touch with both Joffrey and his associates. It's a nice little detail to follow up on their support from the prior game. That is sadly more or less where Calill's relevance in the main plot ends. She falls in with the Crimean Royal Knights, and eventually that group gets absorbed by Ike's army, and she doesn't really have too much else going on for her in terms of meaningful dialogue, barring an optional conversation much later that I'll get to shortly. But right off the bat, there is actually a pretty interesting through line here in regards to Calill's motivations and how they shift between games. In her first game, Calill was a wandering mercenary mage who had no particular cause beyond making money and maybe hooking up with a hot guy. Which again, like, goals, but she didn't really care about Ike's cause or Crimea's struggle. She just wanted to get paid and maybe show off a little. Unlike in many games, where important character details are often buried in obscure supports, the difference in Calill's characterization is honestly pretty self-evident in her presentation in the story and the outward differences from her first appearance. I mean, she's still very much the same character in that she's quite confident and she hasn't lost her sharp tongue, especially when Calill is involved. But she's also much more outwardly compassionate in this iteration. Just take a look at her situation. She's married and chose to adopt a daughter, and she clearly cares deeply for her family. Rather than the wandering free life of a mercenary, she now runs her own inn, a rather humble and respectable occupation by comparison. Her brash and honestly self-centered portrayal in POR feels so far off of a character who would settle down and choose a quiet life, let alone one who would willingly take on the role of a parent by adopting a child. And yet, by Radiant Dawn, her goals and overall mentality have shifted drastically. And yet that aspect of her personality was honestly always present even from the beginning. Despite everything, she did often step back in her supports and take on a more mature role as a mentor, or as someone who is willing to give advice to others. Think back to her teaching Tormod magic, or trying to help Nephany better herself. I feel like she always did have this more mature, caring side, but these details came out more with Radiant Dawn. Though she may not have realized it herself at the time, Calill always had a big heart. That connection really helps her development to work for me and feel congruent and believable rather than forced. But with that said, I feel like it'd be easy to have her soften up in her second appearance, losing her confident side and cutting her quips, but that wouldn't be Calill. Her confidence and sassy side are key pieces of her character, and I love that she gets to retain those even as her character grows. I love seeing her roast Calill even as a more developed character. Granted, that's partially because I love seeing anyone roast Calill, but still, that's beside the point. Calill is still fundamentally the same character at her core, just more mature, fighting for her family and country alike, holding on to things that genuinely matter to her instead of seeking fleeting pleasures. After settling down and finding a true home, Calill's motivations have shifted in a way that feels congruent with her overall character. Money and fame no longer matter to her in Radiant Dawn, and she's ready to risk everything to defend her queen and country, to protect the life that she's built for herself. I just love the development that she goes through, even without the game giving her a major role or even really calling attention to how different she is between games. It's up to the player to notice the shift in the characterization of a relatively peripheral side character, but it's a rewarding detail to pay attention to. Calill's character arc is capped off in one of my absolute favorite smaller conversations in the entire series. Late in Part 4, if the player assigns her to Tibarn's army in particular, Calill can reunite with her daughter Amy. By this point in the story, most of the world has been turned to stone due to the goddess's wrath, and yet Amy managed to avoid such a fate owing to her branded status. When the two reunite, it's instantly clear that nothing else matters to Calill. Immediately, she rushes to her daughter's side and cares for nothing but her well-being. At the end of the world, when the army is facing down a god, just seeing a mother reunite with her daughter, being there to comfort her and assure her that everything is going to be okay, is such a sweet, heartfelt moment, and it's a wonderful way to round out Calill's character. This is a character who joined in her first game with a very silly, jokey conversation, proudly boasting about her abilities with magic and only being concerned with how much money she might make. She judged Ike for his looks alone, disregarding him and being shocked that he was the commander of the army. Her very first introduction to the player is her complaining about buying too much when she was out shopping. Everything about her writing at the beginning suggests that she's just a comic relief character. Yet seeing where she ends up compared to where she started really highlights her as a character with genuine and sincere development. By the end of the Tellius duology, she no longer cares about money, or shopping, or fame, or flings. It's clear that only one singular thing matters the most to her in the whole world: her daughter. I've talked a lot about Calill's development between games, and I think that's fundamentally what makes her so compelling to me. Not too many side characters in Fire Emblem truly get to develop. Most of them get a single game, and while they may overcome some obstacles or flaws in their supports, the nature of the support system makes it improbable, if not impossible, for them to get real development. And that's fine. I can understand and accept that it's an inherent limitation of the structure of the support system. It would be pretty difficult to rewrite every single support to account for the other conversations that the player may or may not have seen. I get it, it's not perfect, but it works for what it is. But I love that Tellius' 2 games allow for even peripheral characters like Calill to get some genuine character development. It's not something that's thrown in the player's face or even really emphasized by the other characters, but she's clearly portrayed differently in her 2 games in a manner that highlights some real development for her. Calill has always been one of my absolute favorite characters in the very strong Tellius cast. I think, even on a surface level, she's just a really fun and entertaining character. She's headstrong, funny, and a fashion icon. Much like with Sarah before her, I think I'd probably enjoy Calill even if there wasn't any depth to her character. But I certainly love that little extra bit of character development that really makes her shine. It gives her such an endearing side and makes her so much more memorable and interesting in the long run. There are plenty of characters in Calill's archetype throughout the series, but few get the chance to round out their character to the degree that she does. From the shopping-obsessed socialite to the cautious magic instructor, from the carefree mercenary to the supportive friend, and from the woman only interested in flings and fashion to the loving mother that she later becomes, all of the shades to Calill's character flow naturally in one sassy yet sweet package that I honestly just adore. There's so much real heart put into her writing that I feel like she really deserves to be highlighted as the well-rounded and endearing character that she is.